Hi, Instructor Glann here. This tutorial is going to be for your use in writing a literature review. And so if you are in any of my classes this term, Soc of Aging, Soc of the Environment, and Soc of Women in Society, then you will be consulting this video to learn how to better construct a literature review if you already know how to construct a literature review, or if you don't know how to construct a literature review, then this video is going to help you learn how to do that. And so we're going to go over what is a literature review. We're going to look at what is the importance of a literature review, both as a standalone paper that synthesizes the existing literature on a topic, but also what role does the lit review play when it's part of a larger work, such as a master's thesis, a senior thesis for an undergrad, or even a dissertation. And so literature review is an important part of any type of scholarly published work because it reviews and looks at all of the existing literature that people have already put out there. So studies that have been conducted and vetted and published on the topics that you're interested in covering and understanding better. And so the first thing I want to have us do today is go over what is a literature review. And so I'm looking at, this is the library website resources of the University of Guelph in California. And it says here, and I'm reading, the definition of a literature review is both a summary and explanation of the complete and current state of knowledge of a limited topic as found in academic books and journal articles. The focus and perspective of your review and the kind of hypothesis or thesis argument you make will be determined by what kind of review you are writing. One way to understand the differences between these two types is to read published literature reviews or the first chapters of theses and dissertations in your subject area. And so this is because a lot of theses and dissertations and scholarly articles follow a predictable format of, you have your abstract, which is a short paragraph basically summarizing your whole article, your whole research study, and that goes in the beginning. But then you're also going to have, at the beginning of your research paper, an introduction, which is going to be a page, maybe a couple pages, and then a literature review, which is usually 5 to 7 pages, depending upon the length requirements for the journal. And then you're going to have your methods chapter where you talk about, or rather your methods section, where you talk about what methodology you used to come to this results that you found that you're presenting from your original research. In the typical structure of a research article, the next section would be the discussion of the results and the findings, and some type of way of linking that back to the literature that's already out there and showing how your work moves those explanations along that are already in that body of knowledge that other scholars have created and amassed. And so then, of course, you have your conclusion. I would like for you to envision this assignment as a literature review that stands alone, so it's not part of a larger research project. So you're not actually going to go out and collect primary data, which is probably a good thing because you would need IRB approval for something like that. What I would like you to do is do a literature review. And so a literature review involves you've developed a thesis statement or a hypothesis as to what you think you're going to find overall when you look at this body of literature on your topic, and you're going to sum that up in like one sentence, and that's your thesis statement. So your thesis statement is more or less what you think you're going to find or what you find when you look at that body of literature. And so for my dissertation research, I studied and am studying contamination in working class communities from sources that have been there, like factories and things, for over 100 years. And so when I write my literature review, my thesis statement should be something like, because I'm interested in people and social movements, how is it that members of a community come to be aware of, but also mobilize around, so engage in activism around an environmental problem that has existed in that community, in that space, for over 100 years. And so that would be my thesis statement. And so that's where you start. That is step number one. And so if you're interested in writing a paper about the water contamination crisis in Flint, Michigan, and the impact that that has had on racial minorities living there, people of color, then you might have a thesis statement like several factors at every level of society, including structural, community, state, city, and individual level factors, contribute to structuring environmental racism risks when dealing with modern infrastructure problems. So another way to put that is when we're trying to figure out how to deal with the fact that our infrastructure is really old, and the pipes through which we get our water and the pipes through which we send our sewage away are starting to erode. We're going to need to take into account that a lot of the proposed solutions to these infrastructural issues might actually be exacerbating or worsening environmental racism problems. And of course, this is happening in Flint. And so the next thing I want to have us talk about is how can I write a literature review that adequately and accurately, but still concisely enough, summarizes and synthesizes all of the necessary sources that you need in order to make your claim and support your argument with corroborating evidence. And so we've gone over what is a literature review. It's a summary of the extant data and findings that are already out there on the topic that you've chosen. And your literature review is going to be, I want you to think about that as like a set of resources that you're going to command to illustrate your thesis statement. And so I'll continue using my dissertation as an example. Because the topic of my dissertation is toxic contamination in working class communities, and more broadly, how people mobilize around environmental problems in these communities when these problems are so old in a lot of places like Lockport, which is where I'm doing my research. How can we think about these issues in this specific context? So you have a Rust Belt city, you have an industrial area, region. The type of pollution that's coming in Lockport is a very particular and unique type of pollution. It's what we call legacy contamination from sources that aren't there anymore. But it's also being probably added to by currently manufacturing companies in the area that have what we call toxic release inventories. So they report that they release health-harming pollution into the air. So how can we use our literature review to organize the existing studies and literature that are out there in such a way that we can command these resources to illustrate our point? And so when I made my literature review, I talked about contamination in working class communities, and so there's a very large literature on that. And so since the 80s and 90s, there's been a growing literature on environmental justice issues in poor and working class communities. So I'm going to look at what studies are classic, what studies have been published most recently. I'm probably not going to need to go any further back than about 20 years in terms of my citations. And so if you have any resources that were published before like 2000 or certainly 1990, they might be too old, so that's a good cutoff point. Research changes, especially when it's related to things like wide-scale changes in society, the environment, issues with aging, and gender. So most sociological issues change pretty quickly, so it's important to have updated resources in your literature review. Mostly from the last 10 years or 15 years if possible. Because this will show the reader that the research that you're using to make your claims is up-to-date research. It's not old science. Your literature review should include, for the purposes of this assignment, 15 to 20 resources, although your typical literature review that would be published as part of a long-form article in a journal article could easily have 30 or 40 resources, if not more. But for the purposes of this class, I'm only having you write a paper using no more than 20 resources. So 15 to 20. Other things that the literature review does: it gives readers easy access to up-to-date research on the topic, so they don't have to go out and read all the studies that you read. The purpose of the literature review is so that the reader can read those studies that you read and be more or less caught up with the literature, so that then they're ready to see how your unique study is contributing or inserting something new into the previous discussion. The literature review is also great because it forces us to summarize each study concisely in a way that we can then refer back to it more easily. You might do this by making an annotated bibliography. An annotated bibliography is a document in and of itself that has all of the citations for all of your sources in the format of your field that you're working in. So for American Sociological Association, that would be for us in sociology. And you're going to have a short paragraph, 3 to 4 sentences, after each citation, summing up that study. So that when you go to do your synthesis in your literature review, you can more easily remind yourself what each of those studies were about. Which is very useful because by the time you're writing the review, it might have been a couple weeks since you actually read the studies. That'll save you from having to read them again. So you have to find your topic. That's step 1. If you've found your topic already, then step 2 is to create a thesis statement that concisely and accurately sums up the idea or ideas that you're going to be presenting in your literature review. Make sure when you start out that your focus is narrow enough so that it is easy to not write a billion pages, because that's going to be hard to find a way to tie it off at the end. So it needs to be specific and narrowed and honed in on what you really want to look at, not too broad. So not like racial stratification in the United States or gender stratification or anything like that. A good rule for that is to pick like a broader topic like racial stratification, and then pick like a case study we've talked about in class. So you wanted to talk about racial inequality in the feminist movement. Then you could say you want to talk about racial inequality, but you would also talk about intersectionality. You would talk about the feminist movement. And you would talk about how Black women were historically left out of the feminist movement, and that's what actually led to the emergence of intersectional feminism. And so to make the case for that kind of literature review, you're going to draw on literatures from racial inequality, intersectional theory, and whatever else you think is going to be important to bring in to illustrate how Black women were historically left out of the mainstream feminist movement. So you would talk about the feminist movement, talk about racial inequality, talk about intersectionality. And there are very large bodies of literature on all of these topics. And so when you're writing your literature review, it will be very important for you to decide first what literatures you're going to look at, how many sources you're going to look at from each literature, and how you're going to make those literatures conversant with one another, so speak to one another, in a way that sets up your unique theoretical insight that you're trying to make with your thesis statement. And so the next thing that you should focus on is reading your articles, making your annotated bibliography with all of your sources. And once you've got your sources all neatly summarized, cited, and organized in your annotated bibliography, then you're ready to write your literature review. You're going to organize the papers you've selected. And again, this is from the University of Gallup, California. Organize the papers you selected by looking for patterns and subtopics. So if you're looking at aging in the life course and how it impacts elderly African American people differently from elderly white people, then you might be interested in looking at what types of diseases elderly black people tend to get more often versus what types of diseases elderly white people tend to get more often. And comparing those might allow you to insert a health component to your discussion of age and race in the life course. And so there's all these literatures that are already out there, and academia and sciences tend to see themselves as building. They're building, they're building, they're building, they're building. They're making bigger and more holistic bodies of literature so that future work can then use that as a foundation to introduce new studies and research based on. Your literature review is that foundation, and that's why it's important. You're going to use your findings from looking at the patterns that you saw in the literatures you looked at to write the body of your paper. You can even use, like each finding as like a title or a subtitle or a subsection of the paper. That's what a lot of people do. So if you decide, I want to study race and aging in the life course, and then your kind of subtopic of that is going to be health inequality among seniors of different races, then your subtopics, based on what you find in the existing literature, might be things like chronic illnesses, mental illnesses, who gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's more, white people or black people, who gets diagnosed with diabetes more, right? And so you could look at it that way. There's census data you could look at. There's CDC, Center for Disease Control data. If you're writing an environmental sociology paper, there's data from the EPA and the DEC. And so there's all these different kinds of resources that you can draw on to make your argument. So when you write your literature review, it's usually going to start out pretty broad, talking about those big macro level constructs that I mentioned. So things like racial inequality, gender inequality, age inequality, or whatever. And then you're going to kind of, as you work your way through the discussion of the literature, get more specific until the idea is you're going to work through gradations of the literature until you gradually and eventually reach a point where you're practically talking about your own work. And so you start out broad and you go down through all of these levels of abstraction until you kind of get to the point where you're talking about the studies that are most similar to the study that you're going to then put forth. And so, what would this look like? Let's go back to the topic from environmental sociology of racial inequality in Flint, Michigan, from the infrastructure decisions made in 2014 to switch the water supply. So here's some background. In 2014, the state government of Michigan made the decision to switch the water supply of Flint, Michigan from the Huron Lake, Lake Huron, where it had been being drawn from since the 50s, to start receiving water for drinking and other purposes from the Flint River. Now, the issue with this is that the Flint River was much more toxic and much more corrosive than Lake Huron. So the water, because it had a different quality and was more toxic and more acidic than the other water source, Lake Huron, the water from the Flint River ate through the aging lead pipelines that carried the water to people's faucets who live in Flint. And the lead flaked off and chipped off into the water. And so since 2014, massive amounts of people, largely African Americans, poor people, poor whites, Latino people, are being effectively lead poisoned by the water that they drink in Flint, Michigan, as a result of this decision that was made by the Michigan government. And Rick Schneider, the governor, still hasn't seen any criminal charges as far as I know. But that's not here or there. So if that's going to be your topic, then you might want to start out talking about racial inequality and how spaces are unequally designated and unequally used for different land uses, and environmental racism, and how environmental justice problems tend to disproportionately impact people of color, because people of color are often segregated into lower income neighborhoods by these structural processes in our society. We also see that they are often targeted by polluters in their neighborhoods. Companies, factories interested in polluting set up shop in these places because they know that there will be less social resistance against people, factories that pollute, moving there, because people want the jobs. And so environmental inequality, environmental justice, environmental racism, you probably need to talk about segregation, redlining, the history of how spaces are used, and then if you wanted to also talk about how the issue is being addressed, You could also talk about what recourse the citizens of Flint have, what resources they're being that are being made available to them, and just more generally, it's a case, right, of not just procedural justice, but also distributive justice, because this is a hazard that has been unequally situated in poor and minority communities. So that's distributive justice. But it's also a hazard that has received an unequal amount of attention from policymakers and people tasked with cleaning up the problem. And so that's a procedural problem. That's procedural justice. Okay, citation. When you're writing your paper, you want to make sure not to plagiarize. That's because your papers will be submitted via Safe Assign or Turnitin software on the university or college's Blackboard platform. And so if you submit a paper that you've written before and you're self-plagiarizing, a paper that someone else has written before, you're plagiarizing them, either another student, so student plagiarizing, or like a website or a book, that's also plagiarism. What is plagiarism? Plagiarism is when you take information from a source, and then you can't or don't cite it properly, both in the text and on the references page. If you don't cite your source properly, that's academic dishonesty and theft, because there's no way for the reader to tell whether or not you're trying to present that person's ideas as your own. And so if you were to copy and paste part of a website into your paper and not put quotes and a citation at the end and a citation in your references page, you could be accused of plagiarism, which carries serious academic consequences. A 0 on the paper, which is 20% of your grade for this class. A 0 in the class. And sometimes it goes all the way up to the college level, and students are expelled or receive other academic punishments for committing academic dishonesty, committing plagiarism, theft. People take a long time to develop ideas and write them, and then they publish them in their name because they want to get credit for that. And so then if other people, students or whomever, come along and try to just take that and claim that for their work, not only is that not fair to the person who made that work, the author, it's also not fair to the student, because they're going to fail. And so just don't do it. How do we avoid plagiarism? Use a citation and references guide. Your citation and references guide should be based on the conventions of the academic discipline that you are writing your literature review for. So if you were writing for American Psychological Association for psychology, you would use APA style citation. If you're writing an English paper, you might use MLA style citation. If you're writing a sociology paper, you're going to use American Sociological Association citation format. And so this has a very specific way that they want you to cite, both in-text citations, so after your quote or whatever information you're using, you're usually going to have sort of parentheticals, the author's last name, and the year that the article or the book or whatever was published. And so that's going to be your in-text citation. I'll show you what this looks like. Give me a second. I was going to try to see if I could find just an article to show you, but maybe I can just find you a book. Okay. This is the book, Not Quite White, The Boundaries of Whiteness, White Trash and the Boundaries of Whiteness, by Matt Ray. He uses a citation format in here that's very similar to sociological citation format. So I'm looking at his chapter 1 right now in his literature review. Here's one. So, Fields, 1985. So that one has a colon after the year, because then they put the page numbers after that. And sometimes if you want to include the specific page numbers, you can do that. And you would do that by putting the author's last name, the year, colon, page numbers inside the parentheticals. However, you're probably going to be doing something much more simple. And so for that, you might have like a quote. So here's your quote. Blah, blah, blah. End quote. Excuse me. Except it's backwards here. Let me write it the other way. It's too hard. Never mind. After the quotation, the end quotation, you're going to put open parenthesis, author's name, so I'm just going to put Glann, year of publication 2018, close parenthesis, period. That's what your in-text citation is going to look like. Use your quote or your paraphrased material. And then in parentheticals before the period, put your last name of the author, not your last name, the last name of the author, and the date of publication, the year. That's an in-text citation. You're also going to need to have a references page at the end of your paper. Usually a references page has a title centered at the top in Microsoft Word. And then each of your references is going to be in paragraph format, which you can get by usually doing like a right click, paragraph, special, and hanging indent. Options in Word, right click, paragraph, special option, hanging indent or hanging. And it's going to make your references look like this. So when they come from the left, the top line is going to go out further than the bottom line. The bottom line of your reference for each reference is going to be tabbed in. Double spaced. Your whole paper should be double spaced, 1-inch margins, Times New Roman or similar font. Page numbers stapled. If someone hands me just a bunch of pages with no numbers and no staple, they're going to get it back. Because what that is to me is something that's going to just fall apart, and then I'm not going to know even what order it should be in. Put your name, put a title page, the name of the class, put my name, put the date on your title page for your paper. When you use ASA format, you can find guides online simply by Googling ASA citation format. Look, I did that one the right way. If you go to Google, you should be able to find tons of guides, and it's just up to you which one you think works the best for the way you think about this process. The Owl Purdue one is pretty good. Buffalo State has a phenomenal one through the E.H. Butler Library. Just Google, there's tons. It's probably like a PDF document. You can find one and use it. It should just be ASA, American Sociological Association. I'm getting better at writing backwards. At the end of your literature review, you're going to point out gaps in the literature, things people haven't studied yet, places where people leave off that other people could pick up. And that's going to be the contribution of your study. So it's not just going to be a synthesis or a summary of all these other studies. It's going to be this work that has a red thread running through it, which is your thesis statement, unifying all of the resources that you're bringing together in order to advance the current literature. So you can make a criticism of the literature. You can say, I looked at all these studies of trans women and feminism and TERFs, trans-exclusionary feminism, and I didn't really see much of a discussion of how intersectionality factors into how likely feminists are to be transphobic. You know, like you could make an argument like that. It just depends on what you're interested in. And so for this class, I would like you to email me your thesis statement. Email me where you're going to get your resources. Email me generally what is your scope of interest or your topic, so that I can get back to you and tell you whether or not your topic is applicable to sociology, whether or not it's feasible given the time frame of the assignment, and whether or not I think it'll be relatively easy for you to write a literature review based on that for this class. All right. If you have any other questions about how to write a literature review, please consult the Guelph University online resource that I mentioned and that I will link in Blackboard. And also, feel free to email me. Don't forget, my email address is glannsm@buffalostate.edu. Writing a literature review is not the easiest thing, but it's a very great skill to have. If you ever have to do something for your job, even if you don't end up becoming an academic researcher or scientist, you might end up working for a company or a firm that says to you one day, go out and see what people have said about whatever issue, right? And you'll need to go out and write a literature review. And you'll need to be able to select the most pertinent ones without getting bogged down by all the resources. And you'll need to find a way to make them speak to each other and answer the question that your boss wants you to answer. So it's a very useful skill to have to be able to write a literature review. And I hope that through doing this exercise in this class, it's a skill that you can begin to hone or continue to hone for your own academic career. This concludes this video. Thank you for watching. I am Instructor Glann, and this has been How to Write a Literature Review for Sociology.